When Violet Ashford walked into that dusty garage on the edge of Tucson, she did not bother to hide her contempt. $1,200,000. That was the exact number she had placed on this land. Isaac Harmon wiped his hands on a grease-stained cloth and said nothing at all. Violet took his silence for surrender. She was wrong. Because behind that crumbling concrete wall, beneath the floor of the most unremarkable garage in the city, lay a collection of racing machines worth $47 million. A legendary inheritance the world had believed was lost forever. Hit play right now to watch the most powerful CEO in the city learn the lesson she never saw coming. Garage Harmon sat between a coin laundry and an empty lot on the south edge of Tucson, Arizona. The painted wooden sign above the door had not been touched in 12 years. The letters faded to the color of old bone, the edges curling at the corners where the desert sun had done its slow, patient work. There was nothing about the building that invited a second glance. From the road, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look. A working garage in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, run by a man who had never felt the need to advertise. The 3 bays ran clean and organized. Tools hung on pegboard outlines, each one returning to its traced position at the end of every working day. Oil drums were labeled and dated. Waste disposal contracts were filed in a manila envelope behind the front counter, updated annually without reminder from anyone. Visitors who noticed these things sometimes remarked on them, almost as an apology for their own surprise. Isaac Harmon was not the kind of man who explained himself. He was the kind of man whose work explained itself, which he found sufficient. Isaac was 42 years old and had spent 20 of those years lying underneath other people's automobiles. His hands showed it, the knuckles thick, the creases along his palms permanently stained with the kind of grime no amount of washing entirely removes. His hair had gone gray at the temples somewhere around his 38th year, though most of his regulars had never noticed the change. Isaac was not the kind of man people studied. He was the kind of man people trusted, which was rarer and worth considerably more, though neither he nor his customers would have thought to frame it in those terms. He did not maintain a business listing. He did not advertise in any form. He did not need either. The battered Dodge belonging to the mail carrier on Route 11 had been in these bays 11 times in 6 years, and each time it had left running better than it arrived. The school district's fleet coordinator had been sending overflow vehicles here since 2011, because Isaac diagnosed faults that the district's own mechanic had missed twice without comment or extra charge. He charged for the work he did, nothing more than that. On the far wall of the front bay, above the parts cabinet and slightly left of center, hung a single photograph. Black and white, slightly yellowed at the edges, mounted in a plain wood frame that had never been replaced. It showed a race car in the instant of crossing a finish line, the body blurred with speed, the crowd behind it a smear of pale faces and open mouths. Beneath the image in small printed text, Daytona 500, 1991, Dale Harmon. The frame had been in that exact position since Isaac first opened the garage in 2001. None of his regulars had ever asked about it. Isaac had never mentioned it. But every evening before he pulled the rolling door down and locked up, he stopped in front of that photograph, no particular expression visible on his face, no gesture that could be read from outside. Just a man confirming that a certain thing was still where it belonged. He never varied this routine, he never explained it. It was one of several things about Isaac Harmon that could not be understood from the outside, and that he had no intention of clarifying. It was a Friday afternoon in late October when the black Escalade parked in front of the garage. The license plate read H. Ford 1. Isaac was underneath a 2016 Tacoma at the time, his hand wrapped around a caliper bolt that had been resisting him for 20 minutes. He heard the car door close with the particular solidity of expensive doors. He heard heels on the concrete. He kept his hand on the bolt. Violet Ashford was 41 years old and dressed in a gray suit that had cost more than most of Isaac's customers spent on their vehicles in a calendar year. She was followed by a man in a navy jacket carrying a leather portfolio, Raymond Cole, her legal director, who had spent the previous decade making difficult acquisition conversations end the way Violet needed them to end. Violet surveyed the interior of Garage Harmon in approximately 4 seconds, the way a person surveys a room they have already decided to change. Her expression was professional and controlled. It was also unmistakably the expression of someone who had determined the outcome before walking through the door. She introduced herself without ceremony. Ashford Capital was developing the Southwest Commercial Corridor, A project called Ashford Plaza, a mixed-use retail and commercial complex that would be the largest single development the city had approved in 15 years. Every surrounding parcel had been secured over the previous 18 months. The land on which Garage Harmon sat was directly central to the acquisition map, and it was the last piece. She explained this without apology, because apology was not part of Violet Ashford's opening position. Raymond opened the portfolio and placed a single document on the counter. $1,200,000 cash equivalent, 30-day closing window, full property transfer including all structures and improvements. He used the phrase fair market value twice. He cited comparables in the corridor. He did not ask Isaac a question. He presented the offer the way a person presents something they do not expect to be refused. Isaac was still underneath the Tacoma. He slid out, stood up, and looked at the document without touching it. Then he looked at Violet, not at Raymond, not at the paperwork, but at Violet directly. He wiped his hands on the shop cloth at his belt. He said, "Can't sell it. Nothing else. No explanation. No courtesy apology." Violet processed this without visible reaction. She had spent 2 decades in commercial real estate and understood that a first refusal was almost always a position rather than a decision. She adjusted $1,500,000. She mentioned timeline flexibility, used the word relocation, suggested the matter of where Isaac established a new operation could be discussed as part of any agreement. Isaac said again quietly, "Can't sell it." Then he looked at the Tacoma, then back at her. "I need to get back to this one." Raymond collected the document from the counter. Violet stood in the middle of the garage for a moment she was not accustomed to, the moment of not knowing what came next, and then she walked out. Before Raymond closed the car door behind her, she said, almost conversationally, "No one turns down Ashford Capital twice." It was not quite a threat. It was closer to a statement of meteorological record. The Escalade pulled away. Isaac listened until the engine sound was gone, looked up at the photograph on the wall for 3 seconds, and went back under the truck. The first letter arrived 12 days later. It came from the Office of Environmental Compliance, City of Tucson, and informed Isaac Harmon that a formal complaint had been filed by a neighboring commercial interest alleging potential violations in the handling, storage, and disposal of petroleum-based materials at his facility. Inspectors would arrive within 72 hours. Failure to cooperate could result in temporary suspension of the business license pending investigation. 2 inspectors came on a Tuesday morning. Isaac met them at the door, shook their hands, and gave them a tour that lasted 90 minutes. The waste oil tracks were current, organized by date, and cross-referenced with collection receipts going back 11 years. The chemical storage cabinet not only met federal specifications but exceeded them. Isaac had overbuilt it in 2013, for reasons of his own that predated any regulatory requirement, and the result was a storage system that surpassed every applicable standard by margins that made both inspectors grow quiet in a particular way. One of them spent 4 minutes reviewing the disposal logs without speaking. They left without citing a single violation. One said, almost under his breath and not quite to anyone in particular, that the documentation he had just seen was better organized than most licensed facilities he had visited in the past year. Raymond Cole received their written report 2 days later, read it twice, and told Violet, "The man keeps records like someone who expected to be audited at any moment." Violet said, "Find another angle." The second approach was quieter and more deliberate. Over the following week, 3 of Isaac's regular commercial counts, a small trucking company, a fleet management firm, and a landscaping operation with 11 vehicles, were each contacted by a representative of a newly opened automotive service center in the Ashford Capital business portfolio. They were offered 6 months of free maintenance on all vehicles, no contract required, no obligation beyond the trial period. 2 transferred their accounts. The third was the fleet coordinator for the Route 11 mail route, a 58-year-old man named Harold, who had been bringing postal vehicles to Isaac since 2004. Harold did not return the call. He later told the Postal Service operations manager that he had no interest in free service from people he did not know when he already had a mechanic he trusted. Isaac noticed the reduced commercial volume the following week when he looked at his incoming schedule. He did not mention it to anyone. Around the same time, a private research firm retained by Ashford Capital submitted a background report on Isaac Harmon. It was 14 pages, thorough on employment history and property records, and it contained 1 paragraph on page 6 that neither Violet nor Raymond properly observed. The paragraph noted Isaac Harmon, born Tucson, Arizona, 1982, mother, Patricia Harmon, née Crawford, father. Listed on original birth certificate as Dale Raymond Crawford, who legally adopted the surname Harmon in 2001 following his marriage to Patricia. Previous legal name, Dale Crawford Harmon. The firm had added a parenthetical noting the prior name and moved on to the next section. Raymond Cole had grown up following hockey and had never attended a race in his life. Violet had grown up following return on investment. The name Dale Harmon meant nothing to either of them. The report was filed and not retrieved again. This oversight was, as everything that followed would eventually make plain, the single most consequential error either of them would make across their entire professional careers. The third approach came from Ashford Capital's legal team, who had been working through municipal archives for anything that could be converted into procedural pressure. What they found was a minor property boundary discrepancy from 1987, a surveying inconsistency between the Harmon parcel and an adjacent lot, documented at the time but never formally adjudicated. The adjacent lot was now held by a private entity. Ashford Capital's team located the holder, negotiated a quiet transfer of the disputed boundary interest, less than 1/3 of 1% of the total line, and prepared a legal notice arguing that this transferred interest gave them standing to contest the parcel title in civil court. Raymond Cole described it to Violet as a pressure instrument rather than a litigation strategy. The point was not to prevail in court, which even he acknowledged was unlikely. The point was to make the duration and cost of continued resistance look worse than accepting the revised offer, which had been raised in internal discussions to $1,800,000. Isaac received the legal notice on a Wednesday at the front counter. He read it completely, folded it once, and set it beside his coffee mug. Then he picked up the telephone. The number he dialed was in Phoenix, a firm with 15 attorneys and a specialty in real property litigation. The partner who answered had handled 3 Ashford Capital disputes in the previous 4 years. He recognized the structure of the notice immediately. He told Isaac he would have an analysis within 48 hours. Isaac thanked him and hung up. It was the 3rd Tuesday of November when Nora Sutton's Subaru gave out 3 blocks from Garage Harmon. The ignition coil had been failing intermittently for a month, and she had been meaning to address it each time it cleared itself and kept running. She pushed the car the last half-block by herself, which was, as she described it later in print, one of the more consequential mechanical failures of her professional life. Nora was 35 and had written for Motor Heritage Quarterly for 12 years, a publication with a print circulation of 40,000 and an influence in the collector vehicle world that exceeded that number considerably. She had spent her career tracking the history of significant racing machines, where they were built, who drove them, and where they had ultimately ended up. She knew the approximate location of most important vehicles currently held in private hands. She also knew, because she had written about it in 2 separate feature pieces, that the whereabouts of Dale Harmon's private collection had been unknown since his death in 2019. No estate inventory had been released. Nothing had appeared at auction anywhere in the world. No museum had announced an acquisition. The collection, 12 cars, assembled by Harmon over 34 years of patient and deliberate effort, last appraised at figures that even conservative estimates placed above $40 million, had simply vanished from the record. The collector community had theories, nobody had answers. Isaac assessed the ignition coil situation within 2 minutes, confirmed the fault, and said he would have the correct part installed and her car moving again in under 2 hours. Nora sat in the single plastic chair in the waiting area, opened her laptop and worked. After 11 minutes she stopped typing. She had noticed the photograph on the far wall. She set the laptop on the chair and crossed the bay. She read the caption line. She looked at the car in the image, the shape of the body, the number 9, the racing livery, the particular quality of sunlight that belonged to Daytona in the early part of the 1990s. She looked at Isaac, who was at the bench sorting a delivery of parts with his back to her. She looked at the photograph once more. Then she asked, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, "Did you know Dale Harmon?" Isaac did not look up. "He was my father." Nora stood still for a moment. In the world she worked in, that sentence was the equivalent of a geologist being told, in passing, that there was a previously undiscovered formation directly beneath the floor she was standing on. She selected her next questions over the following hour with the care of someone who understood that a wrong question at the wrong time closed a door permanently. Isaac answered in his way, briefly, accurately, and without elaboration that extended beyond what had been asked. By the time the Subaru was ready, she had learned almost nothing specific. But she had learned something that mattered considerably more. The smell of the shop was not consistent with what it should have been. Her grandfather had spent 12 years as a track mechanic on the Le Mans circuit, and she had grown up hearing him describe the particular odor of racing-grade lubricants used in high-performance European endurance machines. Oils with viscosity profiles and additive compositions that had no ordinary reason to be present in a neighborhood repair operation in the Arizona desert. She knew the difference between that scent and the standard smell of a working garage. What was in the air at Garage Harmon was not standard. She paid Isaac for the repair, thanked him, and drove away. That evening she searched 2 terms, Dale Harmon and Tucson. Municipal property records returned within 3 minutes. A parcel at the Garage Harmon address had been purchased in cash in 1987 by a Dale Raymond Crawford. A building permit had been filed and approved the following year for a combined garage and extended below-grade storage facility. The permitted below-grade footprint was listed as 840 square meters. Nora read that number 3 times. 840 square meters underground. Beneath an unremarkable garage on the south side of Tucson. She put the laptop away and made herself a meal, because 12 years in this work had taught her not to rush toward the thing she most wanted to find. She let the information settle overnight. In the morning, she began making calls. The administrative inspection order was prepared by Ashford Capital's legal team and filed through the Tucson Office of Urban Management on a Monday morning. It cited both the unresolved boundary interest and the below-grade storage space documented in the original construction permit as grounds for an administrative review of the property. The order was signed by 2 city offices that had cooperated efficiently with Ashford Capital on prior development approvals. Raymond Cole presented the strategy to Violet on a Thursday. It was clean, he said, and legally defensible. His working assumption about what the below-grade space contained was commercial inventory or third-party stored vehicles operating without proper documentation, enough to build a compliance case that would make holding the property significantly more costly than accepting the revised offer. Violet authorized the inspection for the following Thursday morning. Isaac received the order by courier on a Wednesday. He read it at the front counter from the first line to the last. He stood for 6 seconds looking at a fixed point on the wall above the counter. Then he made 2 calls. The first was to the Phoenix firm. The second was to a number he had not dialed in 4 years but had never deleted from his telephone. On Thursday morning, Violet Ashford arrived at 9:15. She brought Raymond Cole, 4 attorneys from the firm, 2 officials from the Office of Urban Management, an architect who specialized in commercial property assessment, and a property valuation specialist whose firm handled high-value asset appraisals for Ashford Capital's development division. 2 vehicles parked at the curb. Violet walked in first. Isaac was underneath a Ford half-ton when they entered. He came out from under it, stood up, and accepted the inspection document Raymond held out without being asked to. He read it again, though he already knew exactly what it contained. A third car pulled up on the street behind the Ashford vehicles. Nora Sutton stepped out carrying a camera bag and a notebook. She had been tracking the public filings related to Ashford Capital and Garage Harmon for 11 days, after a source in the city planning office had alerted her to the inspection request. She positioned herself at the threshold of the open garage door, neither inside the building nor entirely outside it, and she watched without announcing herself. Violet surveyed the garage once. When she spoke, her voice was composed and neutral in the way that took deliberate maintenance. Mr. Harmon, this order requires access to the complete premises, including the below-grade storage space that appears in the original construction permit on file with the city. We'd like to proceed immediately. Isaac set the inspection document on the counter. He wiped his hands on the shop cloth hanging from his belt. He looked at Violet, not at the lawyers, not at the city officials standing behind her, but at Violet. And for the first time since she had first walked into this garage 7 weeks earlier, Violet Ashford experienced something she could not immediately name. It was not fear. It was not doubt in the legal sense. It was the particular discomfort that arrives for a person who has made many careful preparations and is only now beginning to consider that the person across from her made theirs first. Isaac said, "All right, follow me." He walked to the back wall of the garage, past the parts cabinet and the rear workbench, to a floor-to-ceiling tool rack that ran along the entire back wall. The rack held wrenches, ratchets, socket sets, torque drivers, all in their correct positions, all exactly as they appeared. There was nothing unusual about it. Isaac moved to the upper left section and reached behind the rack's vertical support. There was no visible mechanism of any kind. A hydraulic release engaged with a sound barely audible above the ambient noise of the street, a controlled pressurized exhale, and the entire rack swung outward on concealed hinges, moving with a smoothness and precision that suggested serious engineering, revealing a steel door 8 centimeters thick set flush into the concrete of the rear wall. Isaac pressed a 4-digit code into a keypad mounted beside the door. The door swung inward. Cool air moved out through the opening. Not the damp chill of a basement, but the regulated stillness of a climate-controlled preservation environment, the kind of air maintained for objects rather than for people's comfort. With it came a smell that was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around machines that had been driven very hard across very long distances. Nora Sutton, standing at the far end of the group, closed her eyes for 1 second and then opened them again. Isaac descended the staircase, the group followed. 12 steps down. At the bottom, motion sensors triggered the lighting LED panels in precise rows across a ceiling 4 meters above, casting clean, even white light that revealed the space without harshness or dramatic effect. The floor was polished concrete. The walls were white, 800 square meters of preservation space arranged in 12 individual bays, each separated by low brushed steel barriers, each lit by its own independent overhead fixture, each bay occupied by a single vehicle. And beside each vehicle, mounted on a steel stand at eye level, a placard in brushed copper with a vehicle designation, a year, and a brief provenance note. Not one person in the group said anything. The car in the first bay was blue and gold, the deep navy and burnished gold of a racing livery that had remained unchanged from the first qualifying session to the final lap. A white circle on the driver's door held the number 9 in bold black numerals. The paint was not restored. It was original, maintained and stabilized, but never refinished, carrying every mark it had earned from the races it had run. Isaac crossed the floor and placed his hand flat on the roof panel. It was the gesture of a man who has touched a particular surface 10,000 times and knows exactly how it feels. In the second bay, a Ford GT40 Mark II from 1966, purchased from a private holding in Lyon in 1994. Third bay, a Dodge Charger Daytona from 1969, original factory designation, original chassis number, one of 503 ever built, completely unmodified since the day it left the assembly plant 55 years prior. Moving along the polished floor, a Porsche 917 in the orange and pale blue of Gulf livery. A Ferrari from the mid-1970s championship period, the paint still carrying the specific red that photographers of that era spent entire careers trying to capture correctly on film. A Shelby Cobra Daytona coupe with its long-tailed body exactly as Shelby's team had built it for the endurance circuit. A Lotus Formula One car from the late 1960s with its original suspension geometry and wing configuration intact. A Can-Am prototype from '72, a Lancia from the golden years of European rallying, a Jaguar from the endurance races of the 1950s that had finished the race it was entered in and had not been significantly touched since. And 2 others, the copper placards beside them carrying names and specifications that made the property valuation specialist, a man with 20 years of experience appraising significant assets across 4 continents, set his hand flat against the nearest wall for a moment. Not for balance. For something he could not have named but which was, in its way, a response to the weight of what he was looking at. Raymond Cole had walked to the Dodge Charger Daytona. He stood very close to the door panel, his hand extended and then stopped an inch from the surface. He did not touch it. In 15 years of law and commercial deal-making, in which he had moved through boardrooms and courtrooms and properties worth hundreds of millions, he had never once been in the presence of something where touching felt like a transgression rather than a right. He withdrew his hand and stood back. Violet Ashford stood in the center of the room. She turned slowly from bay to bay, taking in one car, then the next, then the next. In 20 years of commercial acquisition, she had appraised warehouses, raw land, industrial facilities, luxury developments, and agricultural operations across 5 states. She had never once been unable to calculate what she was looking at. She could not calculate this. The number would not form. The room refused to become a transaction, and that refusal was coming from something other than the law. One of the city officials said, barely above a murmur, "What is all this?" Isaac spoke from beside the number 9 car. His voice carried the same register it always carried, measured, level, without performance. "My father began collecting in 1985. He built this space in 1988, before most of the world outside the racing circuit knew his name. He said these cars weren't trophies, they were records. He wanted them kept together and kept intact, until the right arrangement could be made that would preserve them properly and permanently. He paused. He died in 2019. I have been keeping his word since then. Nora Sutton stood at the base of the staircase. She had followed the group down without invitation, and no one had moved to stop her, and she understood that this was one of the moments in a career that required a witness. She was not writing. She was memorizing. Isaac walked to a small steel cabinet mounted into the wall between bays 7 and 8. He opened it with a key from his belt ring and removed a blue folder. He set it on the hood of the number 9 car. The first document was an agreement with the National Motor Racing Museum, executed 8 months prior. The full collection would transfer to a permanent dedicated gallery upon completion of the museum's current expansion. The gallery had a name, the Dale Harmon Legacy Wing. The conservation endowment attached to the agreement, $3,200,000 per year from a National Heritage Preservation Fund, committed for 15 years with renewal provisions. The second document bore the letterhead of Bonham's Auction House in London, a preliminary valuation report signed by their senior specialist in historic racing vehicles. The total estimated value of the collection, given current market conditions and the unique provenance of several specific items, $47,300,000. The third document was a production contract with Meridian Pictures for a feature-length documentary on Dale Harmon and his collection. Principal photography was scheduled to begin at Garage Harmon the following spring. International distribution had already been committed through 2 broadcast networks. The working title appeared at the top of the first page. The fourth document was a legal opinion from the Phoenix firm, dated the previous week, addressing directly the boundary dispute that Ashford Capital had introduced. The opinion was 8 pages. Its conclusion occupied 3 sentences. The transferred boundary interest was legally insufficient to constitute a title claim under Arizona property law. The matter had been formally resolved and recorded in the county recorder's office 4 days prior. Isaac Harmon held clear and unencumbered title to the entirety of his parcel. Raymond Cole looked at the fourth document the longest. He read each sentence with the precision of a trained attorney and with the particular attention of a person who understands exactly what each sentence costs. He understood what it meant that all 4 documents existed before the inspection had ever been filed. He understood what it meant that they had been prepared and placed in a locked cabinet in a climate-controlled basement months before Ashford Capital had produced a single page of paperwork related to this property. He understood that he was not standing in a trap he had stumbled into. He was standing in a room that had been waiting for him. Isaac spoke without raising his voice. You came here with an inspection order looking for something you could convert into leverage. There is nothing to find. You came here 6 weeks ago with $1,200,000 for a piece of land that sits above a collection valued at 40 times that number. And everything that happened in between, the environmental complaint, the commercial accounts you approached, the boundary interest you purchased and filed, I have records of all of it. So does my attorney in Phoenix. The 2 city officials had, without announcement or discussion between them, turned and started up the staircase. Their footsteps were quiet and even. They did not look back. Raymond closed his portfolio. He did it without rushing, which was in its way worse than if he had hurried. He did not speak. He did not look at Isaac. He went upstairs. The valuation specialist said quietly to no one he intended to address, I'll need to revise my materials. Then he followed. Violet Ashford stood in the center of the room a moment longer. The lighting held steady. $47 million in irreplaceable machinery surrounded her in 12 bays, and every piece of it belonged to the man in the work clothes standing beside the car his father had driven across the finish line 33 years ago. She had come here with instruments of pressure. She had found, instead, a room that had been sealed and ready and waiting since long before she arrived. She had nothing further to say. She went upstairs and outside into the October light, and nothing around her looked the way it had when she had parked and walked in 45 minutes earlier. 3 days later, Nora Sutton's article appeared in print and digital editions of Motor Heritage Quarterly. The headline, The Last Garage. Inside the $47 million secret Dale Harmon left his son. 4,200 words, with photographs taken inside the basement that week and archival images supplied by Isaac, along with a full documented account of the Ashford Capital approach and how it had ended. It became the most read piece in the publication's 31-year history within the first 48 hours of release. The automotive press picked it up. The business press picked it up. 3 evening television news programs ran segments the same week. The motorsport community, which held the name Dale Harmon in the particular regard that certain worlds reserve for their own, responded with a volume and unity of feeling that surprised the mainstream coverage that had assumed it was primarily a business story. Within a week, Ashford Capital appeared in more than 200 published articles. In almost none of them was the framing favorable. 3 of Ashford Capital's institutional partners sent formal letters requesting written explanations before the end of the following business week. A shareholder group representing 14% of the company's outstanding equity called for an independent review of acquisition practices. 2 pending city development approvals were placed on administrative hold by offices that had, until very recently, been smoothly accommodating. Raymond Cole's termination letter was signed by Violet on a Friday afternoon. It took her less than 3 minutes. She did not convene a meeting. She did not brief the board in advance or prepare a statement. Raymond had designed the specific tactics, the environmental complaint, the commercial account outreach, the boundary purchase and filing, and Violet understood, with a clarity that had arrived considerably too late to be useful, that authorizing a strategy and designing it are not morally equivalent, but that they are exactly equivalent when a person is being honest with herself about what she knew and when she knew it. Her father called that evening. Gerald Ashford was 70 years old and had spent 40 of those years building the company that carried his name. He did not ask her to account for herself. He said, "I gave you a business, Violet. You used it to try to take something from a man who was protecting his father's memory. That is not what I built this for." He ended the call before she had formed a response. She sat in her office until past 10 o'clock, the city lit below her windows in the way that looked like prosperity from a sufficient distance. She tried to identify precisely what she had lost. It was not a legal dispute. There had never been a legal dispute, because Isaac Harmon had made certain there could not be one. It was not a significant financial loss at the scale at which Ashford Capital operated. What she had lost was harder to name and considerably harder to rebuild, and she recognized it with the same precision she brought to financial assessments. She had looked at a person and seen only a variable in someone else's calculation. That was the error, not the tactics that followed from it. The error was the first look. The opening of the Dale Harmon Legacy Wing took place 6 weeks later at the National Motor Racing Museum. Isaac wore a dark blue suit that had belonged to his father, altered twice over the years to fit his own frame, and he stood beside the number 9 car while the museum director addressed 240 guests. The director spoke about Dale Harmon's 3 championships, about the Le Mans podium, about 34 years of deliberate and quiet collecting that most of the racing world had known nothing about until a month prior. Nora Sutton sat in the 3rd row. Near the end of the reception, when most of the room had moved to the adjacent gallery, Violet Ashford came through a side entrance. She wore a dark coat. She came alone, no assistant, no attorneys, nothing that identified her as the head of anything. She moved through the space and stopped in front of the number 9 car. Isaac saw her enter. He waited until she had been standing there for a moment and then crossed the floor and stopped a few feet from her. Neither of them spoke immediately. Violet looked at the car for a long moment. Then she turned. "I'm not here to offer anything," she said, "and I'm not here to ask for anything. I want to say that I looked at you and I saw a land value and a timeline and an obstacle. That was wrong, not because of what it cost me, but because it was wrong before I knew what it would cost." Isaac looked at her for a moment. Then at the car. "My father used to say the real value of something isn't the price someone puts on it. It's the reason the person holding it won't let go." Violet received that quietly. She nodded once. Isaac extended his hand and she took it, a brief, firm handshake, the kind that makes no promise forward and requires none. 2 people standing in front of a car that had always been going to stay exactly where it was, and acknowledging it plainly. Nora Sutton saw the handshake from near the exit. She did not write it down. The following Monday, Garage Harmon opened at 7 in the morning. Isaac was underneath a Silverado by 7:15. The rolling door was up, the lights were on, and the painted wooden sign above the entrance still said what it had always said. The letters faded, the edges curling from years of Arizona sun, the name unchanged. A few new faces came in that week, people who had made the drive to the south side of Tucson after reading about the garage. Isaac quoted them the same rates he quoted everyone else, diagnosed their vehicles with the same efficiency, and did not treat them differently for knowing his name. The documentary premiered in September. The poster showed a pair of hands holding a wrench, and behind them, slightly out of focus, the blue and gold of the number 9 car. The subtitle read, "The Man Who Kept the Engines Running." Isaac was listed as the primary historical consultant and as the documentary's principal narrator. His voice, it turned out, was suited to the work, unhurried, precise, without performance of any kind. Ashford Plaza was never built. The acquisition map that had made the Garage Harmon parcel so central to the project was archived without ceremony. The surrounding properties Ashford Capital had already secured were sold individually over the following 18 months, at a net figure the annual report described as a portfolio adjustment. On the last evening of October, 1 year, nearly to the day, from the afternoon the black Escalade had first parked in front of his door, Isaac locked the rolling door and stood for a moment in the dark bay. The photograph on the wall was lit by the single bulb he left on overnight. Dale Harmon, 1991, Daytona, crossing the line. The number 9 car was in a museum now under soft white LED light, behind a low barrier with a placard in brushed copper. Several hundred people would walk past it that week, and several hundred more the week after, and some of them would understand exactly what they were looking at, and some of them would not, and that was as it should be. The photograph was still here, on the wall of the most ordinary garage in Tucson. Because some things do not require an audience to have value. They only require someone willing to hold them long enough, and for the right reasons until the world is ready. Isaac switched off the overhead light and went home.